Look at this image. Look closely at the cold, polished chrome, the unapologetic stare, the gloved hand resting with absolute authority on the steering wheel of a machine built for speed and danger. For nearly a century, this painting has been the ultimate symbol of the Roaring Twenties. It represents wealth. It represents raw power. It represents a woman who conquered a world built by men and forced it to play by her rules. When you stand in front of this canvas, you are supposed to feel small. You are supposed to feel the weight of her undeniable perfection. But there is a fundamental problem with everything you are seeing right now. A problem that art historians and critics have quietly ignored for decades. Nothing in this image is real. The woman driving is a ghost of her own making. The car she is sitting in never existed. The absolute control she projects is nothing but a desperate, calculated fabrication. And the secret hiding behind this masterpiece is so deeply disturbing that it shatters the entire history of modern art. We are taught to believe what we see in museums. We assume that a framed piece of canvas holds historical truth. But take a moment to ask yourself this. Consider how easily we accept a beautiful lie simply because it is painted with undeniable mastery. How much of our history is just a carefully constructed mask designed to hide the trauma underneath? We rarely question the mind of the artist. We simply consume the aesthetics. But when you stop looking at the brushstrokes and start looking at the psychology, the canvas stops being a masterpiece. It becomes a crime scene.
I can't keep this
Experts
secret
look at the
anymore.
paint and
Guilt
see
is killing me.
genius. I close my eyes and hear a confession. I am the Blind Curator, and today we are going to dissect the perfect lie. The year is 1929. The world is changing at a breakneck pace. The unimaginable trauma of the First World War has left Europe shattered, but from those bloody ruins, a new obsession is born. Speed, steel, machines, the future. In Paris, the Jazz Age is at its absolute peak. It is a city of excess, of wild, creative freedom, and of dangerous glamour. And right in the center of this intoxicating storm is a woman named Tamara de Lempicka. She is known as the Baroness with a brush, dazzlingly charismatic, openly bisexual, and deeply immersed in the darkest and brightest corners of Parisian high society. She paints the elite, and she does it with a visual language of sharp geometric angles and seductive reflective surfaces. She is not just an artist, she is an icon, a living, breathing piece of Art Deco. Her figures are monumental, sculpted, emotionally sealed. They meet the viewer's gaze with an authority that borders on the divine. But this monumental image was a fortress, and fortresses are only built by people who are terrified of the outside world. Paris in the 1920s was not just a city, it was a fever. The First World War had slaughtered millions, toppled ancient empires, and left a generation deeply traumatized. But from the ashes of that unimaginable grief came a desperate, almost violent need to live. They called it the Roaring Twenties, the Jazz Age, a time when old morals were thrown out the window, replaced by an absolute fascination with the modern world. Skyscrapers, electric lights, automobiles, cinema, everything was moving faster, and the survivors wanted to move fast with it. In the middle of this chaotic, hedonistic playground, Tamara de Lempicka arrived. And she did not just participate in the culture, she dominated it. At a time when women were still fighting for basic agency, she walked into a fiercely male-dominated art world and demanded the spotlight. She was not a passive muse waiting to be painted by a famous man. She was the one holding the brush, and she made sure everyone knew her name. The press quickly became obsessed with her. They called her the Baroness with a brush. She was dazzlingly charismatic, fiercely independent, and openly bisexual in an era when such things were usually kept completely in the shadows. She threw legendary parties, mingled with wealthy aristocrats, and seduced both men and women with the same calculating charm. She was the ultimate modern woman, but her true power was not in her social life. It was in how she translated that life onto the canvas. Look closely at her style. It is often called Art Deco, but it is something much colder, much more precise. She took the fragmented structural ideas of Cubism and smoothed them out into polished chrome. Her figures do not look like warm flesh and blood. They look like they are carved from marble and steel. The women in her paintings are monumental. They are worldly, unapologetic, and completely emotionally sealed. They look out at the viewer not with vulnerability, but with a predatory confidence. She painted a world intoxicated by luxury and progress, bold geometric shapes, deep, vibrant colors, crisp lines that leave absolutely no room for error. Everything is orderly, clean, untouchable. Her art satisfied a deep psychological need for order in a world that had just survived the brutal chaos of global war. The elite looked at her paintings and saw the perfect future. And nobody embodied this mechanical perfection more than Tamara herself. She carefully constructed her public image with the same ruthless precision she used to mix her paints. She wore the finest couture. She commanded the highest prices. She seemed entirely immune to the struggles of ordinary human beings. She was worshipped as a goddess of the machine age. But if you study human behavior, you know one absolute truth. Nobody is actually that perfect. Nobody is naturally that cold. When someone builds a wall of solid steel around their identity, it is never because they are strong. It is always because they are hiding something incredibly fragile inside. And Tamara's wall of steel was about to crack. To understand a lie, you have to look at the edges of the canvas. You have to find the places where the paint starts to chip, the hidden corners where the artist's hand trembled. For Tamara de Lempicka, the chipping did not start with her art. It started with her own identity. If you look through the high society records of the 1920s, you will find a woman who seemed to have materialized out of thin air, fully formed, dripping in diamonds, and entirely devoid of vulnerability. But when modern historians finally began digging into her past, peeling back the layers of her public persona, they found that almost every single detail she offered about her early life was a calculated fabrication. She lied about her age, constantly shifting the year of her birth to appear younger, more prodigious, and more relevant to a society obsessed with youth. She lied about where she was born, creating a romanticized origin story that perfectly fit the narrative of a mysterious, wandering aristocrat. But her most brilliant and ruthless deception was not about her age or her geography. It was about her gender. When she first began exhibiting her work in the prestigious Parisian salons between 1922 and 1925, she knew exactly how the game was played. The art world was an exclusive club, entirely controlled by wealthy, conservative men. A female artist, no matter how aggressively talented, would be immediately dismissed as a novelty, a mere hobbyist. So, she removed the feminine ending of her name. She signed her bold, striking paintings simply as Lempicka, the masculine version. She deliberately allowed the official exhibition catalogs to list her as a male painter, and it worked. For 3 years, the elite art critics of Paris praised the strong, masculine, structural genius of Lempicka. They bought the paintings, they elevated the name. They were completely unaware that the hands mixing the paint and the mind designing the geometry belonged to a woman. It was a masterclass in psychological manipulation. She hacked a patriarchal system from the inside out, letting the men worship her work before finally dropping the disguise and revealing her true identity in 1925. By the time the critics realized they had been tricked, it was too late. She was already famous. The trap had closed. But this sequence of events raises a much darker question for anyone willing to look closer. A woman who is willing to erase her name, alter her age, and fabricate her history is a woman who understands how to build a bulletproof disguise. She did not just paint canvas, she painted her own reality. She manipulated the perception of everyone around her because she fundamentally believed that the truth was a liability. If you give people the truth, they have power over you. If you give them a myth, you control them entirely. And this realization brings us right back to the image of the Green Bugatti, the ultimate myth. If her name was a weapon and her past was a shadow, then the painting that made her immortal is the greatest deception of them all. Because the woman behind the wheel of that machine is not looking at you with natural superiority. She is looking at you to make sure you bought the lie. Let us return to the canvas, the Green Bugatti, the painting that made her an overnight sensation. It was commissioned in 1929 for the cover of a highly influential German fashion magazine called Die Dame. The publication was aimed at affluent, sophisticated, urban women. They wanted an image of ultimate modern liberation. Tamara gave them a masterpiece. But let's strip away the oil paint and look at the cold reality. Tamara de Lempicka did not own a Green Bugatti. She drove a small, practical, entirely unremarkable yellow Renault. She did not race through the neon streets of Paris in a chrome beast of elite engineering. She invented the car strictly for the canvas. She upgraded her reality to fit the myths she was violently selling to the world. She knew that a small yellow Renault does not command respect. It does not intimidate. But a Bugatti is a machine of pure, unadulterated power. But the lie of the car is just the surface. We need to look deeper. Look at the fabric. Notice the dramatic, billowing scarf wrapping tightly around her neck and fluttering out into the violent wind. To a modern audience, it just looks like a glamorous Art Deco fashion choice. But to an audience in 1929, that scarf was a deeply unsettling, almost grotesque symbol. It was a fresh reminder of a horrific tragedy. Just 2 years earlier, the world-famous dancer Isadora Duncan was killed in a gruesome and highly publicized accident. She was riding in an open-air sports car, wearing a long, flowing silk scarf. The fabric became violently entangled in the heavy spokes of the rear wheel, breaking her neck in a fraction of a second. The world was terrified by the story. It was a grim, bloody reminder that these beautiful, fast machines were also uncontrollable metal death traps. Tamara knew exactly what she was doing when she painted that heavy fabric blowing in the wind. She was not just painting a piece of clothing, she was painting the very instrument of a famous woman's death. And she painted herself wearing it, completely unbothered, her gloved hand resting lightly on the steering wheel. This changes the entire meaning of the artwork. It is no longer a fashion statement, it is a calculated psychological declaration. She is placing herself inside a machine of death, wearing a symbol of tragedy and staring you down with half-closed, arrogant eyes. She is telling the viewer, I am fully aware of the danger and I am entirely in control of it. But ask yourself this. Who needs to broadcast that level of absolute control? Who needs to paint themselves dominating death and poverty so publicly, so desperately? Only someone who has looked directly into the abyss and barely escaped with their life. To understand the lie of the Green Bugatti, we must look away from the glamour of Paris. We must go back to 1917. To the freezing, blood-stained streets of St. Petersburg during the Russian Revolution. This is where the polished chrome of Tamara's art was actually forged, not in wealth, but in absolute, paralyzing terror. Before she was the Baroness with a brush, she was a woman who watched her entire world of privilege burn to the ground in a matter of days. Her husband was arrested by the Bolsheviks in the dead of night. For weeks, she did not know if he was alive or dead. She was a young woman, suddenly stripped of all power, navigating a city descending into violent chaos. She had to use every ounce of her charm, her intellect, and her remaining wealth to bribe prison officials. She managed to secure his release, but the trauma of that profound helplessness permanently altered her psychological architecture. They fled to Paris as penniless refugees. They had nothing. The illusion of safety had been violently shattered. When you survive that level of catastrophic loss, your brain rewires itself. You learn that the world is inherently unpredictable and dangerous. You learn that depending on others is a fatal mistake. And most importantly, you learn that control is the only thing that can keep you alive. When Tamara arrived in Paris, her husband was a broken man, incapable of supporting them. She was faced with grinding poverty, the kind of poverty that slowly erodes your dignity. So she made a ruthless decision. She would paint, not for the love of art, not for creative expression, but for pure, cold survival. This is the psychological key that unlocks her entire body of work. Every sharp angle, every cold stare, every monumental figure she painted was a deliberate rejection of vulnerability. She painted women who looked like they could never be hurt because she was terrified of being hurt again. There is a deeply revealing detail about her habits that art historians often treat as a quirky, glamorous footnote. As she became famous and the money finally started pouring in, Tamara made a strict rule for herself. Every time she sold a painting, she would take the profits and immediately buy a diamond bracelet. She wore them stacked heavily on her wrists. The press thought it was just the vanity of a wealthy artist, but the truth was a trauma response. Tamara knew from bitter experience that cash becomes worthless in a revolution. Bank accounts get frozen, homes get seized by the state. But if you have to flee in the middle of the night, you can sew diamonds into the lining of your coat. She was the toast of Paris, living in absolute luxury, yet she was constantly, obsessively preparing for the world to end again. And when you realize that, the painting changes entirely. The green Bugatti, the chrome, the steel. It wasn't an arrogant display of wealth, it was a fortress. She painted herself inside a metal shell, because machines do not feel fear, they do not starve, and they do not become refugees.
We look at the green Bugatti and we see exactly what we want to see. The art world swallowed the lie because a beautiful, glamorous lie is always easier to digest than an ugly, traumatized truth. Society wanted a goddess of the modern age. They did not want a terrified survivor clutching her diamonds in the dark. So Tamara gave them the goddess. She played the role flawlessly, right up until the very end. Decades later, long after the roaring Twenties had faded into history, Tamara de Lempicka died in Mexico. But even in death, she refused to let go of the myth. Her final, absolute demand was for her ashes to be taken by a helicopter and scattered directly into the mouth of an active volcano. A violently theatrical end for a completely fabricated life. She made sure that no one could ever truly pin her down, not in life, and certainly not in death. She used her canvas as a shield, a brilliantly constructed wall of chrome and paint to hide her profound fear from a world that had already taken everything from her once. But the truth about art is that it always reveals the mind of the creator. Always. While Tamara used her art to hide her terror, others have used it for something much darker. Sometimes a painting is not a shield. Sometimes it is a confession. In the year 1606, a brilliant, violently unstable artist committed a brutal, bloody murder in the dark streets of Rome. He was hunted by the authorities. He was desperate, and in his madness, he painted his victim and he painted himself. He hid his own psychological confession in plain sight, right there on the canvas. A secret painted in oil, waiting for centuries for someone to truly understand what they were looking at. But that is a case for our next investigation. Keep your eyes closed.